Hey guys, it's Mario here today with a special guest. His name is Alberto Nunez. He's from a team called 3D Muscle Journey, very famous team of coaches in the world of natural bodybuilding. Alberto here, he's a lifetime natural bodybuilder. First time he stepped on stage was back in 2007. That is 10 years at the time of making these videos. That's a long time. This guy is one of the most shredded people that I've ever seen in my entire life. I want to welcome you, Alberto. How are you doing, man?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. And you said special guests, so I take it some of them aren't special. I I will try to wear that honor proudly today and do uh, to my best of my abilities, help perhaps clear out some misconceptions and just generally have a good time and be informative while we're doing it. So I look forward to it.
Awesome, man. Yeah, it's great having you here. I know you do a lot of work with competitors on the channel. Of course, I would say that most of us aren't competing, but there's a lot of enthusiasts that truly want to maximize their results, and the time and effort that are put in here, it's a lot. So, for all the people that don't know you, can you just share a little bit of your story, how you got started, and basically your experience as a coach and as an athlete as well?
Well, shoot, I think initially the weightlifting and the body recomping that wasn't something that captivated me as a young man. I didn't really understand when I was at that age where appearance is very important to you. You know, in your teen years, um, why muscles were cool and why it was so appealing. So all my friends wanted these big muscles. I really didn't. I just wanted to play sports, and that was my thing. Unlike a lot of young men, I didn't really dabble into the weightlifting. Didn't really care to. And it wasn't until my first few goes at it that I'm like, oh wow, this is like really cool. This is really fun. Being strong is pretty awesome. And it just felt right. It felt right. And then, of course, you start putting on a little muscle. Your peers start giving you the thumbs up, especially the opposite sex. And it just kind of took off from there. And then eventually, after about 8 years of just kind of lifting recreationally, going through the typical gaining and cutting cycles, I decided, hey, let's let this thing evolve and naturally the next thing would be competing on stage and doing kind of the same things that I was doing already in regards to like my recompositioning of my body, but taking it to that extra extreme. So I spent a good almost 10 years as a pretty I guess you could say serious recreational lifter, and then time flies in the last decade or so as a competitive bodybuilder, in the last decade or so also helping other athletes with some of the same things that I'm into now. And yeah, looking back now, it's like I never would have thought that here I would be talking about putting on muscle and losing fat. But it's my life's passion at this point, safe to say.
Yeah, man. And those that are really not familiar with your journey, I would actually invite them to go to the 3D MJ channel and check out older videos where you really talk about those phases when you're actually in the midst of a prep and things like that. There's a lot of lessons that a person actually learns from a deep caloric deficit.
Oh,
So almost a
oh,
spiritual enlightenment kind of situation. And we're going to talk a bit about that here. I mean, the topic of this whole thing here is, I mean, you obviously are in terms of like the bodybuilding and natural bodybuilding world, a lot of people would even use your photo as an example of like the as the shredded as you can get naturally. And that's why I wanted to pick the topic for this talk to be how to get shredded naturally and what would be kind of the path that someone would follow. So, I mean, to take a step back of being shredded, before you're even considering being shredded, you're most likely in some kind of gaining phase or at least in some kind of maintenance phase. How would you, let's say, transition an athlete or yourself uh, from, let's say, the lean gaining phase or kind of a bulk or a maintenance into a fat loss phase? What are some of the things to consider there?
I think to start off is the experience of the dieter. I think with every diet we get better, not just in regards to our methods, but our coping skills under diet caloric restriction. So first is well, how long has this person been doing this? If perhaps this is their first time really undertaking any kind of structured diet, and it just happens to be a caloric restriction, right? You definitely have to cater to that. I will venture. This is a bit out there, but I will say that almost everyone who's been through a few fat loss phases can almost feel how it accumulates in regards to your willpower tank. You know, your first fat loss, like you're excited, you got your willpower tanks at full, but you know, as we go, that decreases, and then also there's like that mental scarring, right? There's a lot of people who cannot stick to a fat loss phase now because of some mishaps they took on early on when they were trying to go through some fat loss phases. So I think in regards to expectations and how you model a fat loss diet, firstly, you need to look at what sort of experience this person has when it comes to caloric restriction. And it could be like they have too much. Maybe they were in a weight class restricted sport. Maybe they did wrestling, right? That sort of stuff, which
Hmm.
can,
Hmm.
play a role in regards to how they perceive the fat loss diet, or they just don't have enough. So you start there. How experienced are you? And then based off that, you decide how lean this person is going to get and how long the diet will last. I would urge people to start slow, be patient with themselves, just how we do it in the weight room, like the whole progressive overload. The same things apply for sure when it comes to how we cope with stress during a fat loss phase.
Absolutely agreed there, and on the point of know yourself.
Know
Absolutely,
yourself.
very, very important. A lot of people will, at least from my experience, bite off a lot more than they can chew, and that's usually setting yourself up for failure in the long run. Now, of course, looking at the research, we can see that, let's say there's been some research on crash dieting, and in certain cases, it usually comes down to whether you have an exit strategy or not. You know, it's not necessarily that bad to lose a little bit more in the beginning, but if you don't have an exit strategy, which is most people, then you're gonna be in trouble. And speaking of, let's say, topic of getting shredded, before we get into the gist of it, a lot of comments that I get, let's say on my videos, and I'm nowhere near as shredded as you, and I'm probably like a couple of like percentages above for sure, competition stage level, but people will say, hey man, you look unhealthy, like you don't look healthy, and you, that's not healthy, right? That's kind of the main comment you would get. And I know, I mean, I know that in a certain way that isn't very healthy to be at a 5% body fat for most for most definitions. What's your take on that? What would you answer to someone saying that?
I think even when you go from like a recreational lifter to like I want to take this a bit more serious, um, the us doing it for health is maybe not at the forefront. It should be a priority, but it's not always at the top of the list, right? Um, so a good example of this would be like let's just look at strength. Like we could create some arbitrary numbers for a healthy young man. If he could, bench press 225 for a clean single, squat 315, with good range of motion for a clean single, maybe approaching the 400-pound mark on that deadlift. That's a very strong person, right? But if you want to go past that, it's going to get to the point where, every once in a while, a knee might hurt, a shoulder might hurt. So you almost make a deal with the devil. It's a compromise. And anyone that goes from, hey, they're playing basketball with their friends in the playground and they're just kind of shooting with each other to like, I want to join the school basketball team. Guess what? You might get a few elbows to your face, but that's something that you signed up for once you decide to pick it up a notch. And I think that's just like the spirit of any athletic endeavor, especially when you want to go, when you want to push it a little bit more. And then, of course, you have people such as myself who want to push it that far. And
Yeah.
in that case, yeah, there's certainly some phases that I would certainly say that they're not healthy, but at no point am I doing this for like primarily health at this point. I think if I was retired from competing and I didn't was not emaciating myself every few years, the way I train in general would look very, very, very different. So I guess my answer to that would be like, well, health is important, but it's almost, and it's kind of risky to say this because some people might take it the wrong way, but almost besides the point here, you know?
Exactly, exactly. I really like your answer in that, because the point is that if you want to excel to a world-class level in any sport, it's going to take an incredible amount of sacrifice, and you have to pay the price if you want to actually achieve the goal. And a lot of people aren't really willing to pay the price, and that's okay. I think that not a lot of advice out there that it's okay if you don't want
Mhm.
to be shredded all year round, that it's totally fine. And this whole pressure put on guys, especially in this social media kind of run world that we're in right now is to be shredded. And on a seminar, I'm often going to be asked, well, why are you doing that? Like, why would you do that to yourself? Well, it's not, I mean, my reason and your reason might be totally different, right? And that's different standards as well. I don't want to be too much on that. Okay, let's do a little bit of a case study. That's kind of how I would like to, because we talked about someone being lean gaining, let's say bulking. Let's say a person, we take a guy, he's about 180 pounds. Uh, he's roughly at about 20% body fat. And if we strip off his fat mass, let's say we have about 144 lean body mass in pounds, right? And let's say we want to get that person from 20% body fat to 10% body fat. So we would take that 144 divided by 0.9. We get about 160 pounds, right? A rough calculation here. And at that point, he would be approximately at 10% body fat. Now, a lot of people will see that number and they're going to see, well, 180 and 160, there's only 20 pounds to lose. That's probably going to take like 12 to 15 weeks, and where I'm gonna be all good, right? What's I guess the rate? People say how long it's gonna take. What's your take on this? I mean, losing this amount, let's say 20 pounds is the amount that you kind of predicted.
Mhm.
How long would that generally take?
Going back to how experienced is this person. So for example, whenever I do have for example, my cleanup phases when I'm gaining in the off season, I am a bit more versed than I was a few years ago in regards to how to handling the deficit. I have my little quirks that help me get through it. I know how to get there in a pretty straightforward manner. There's very little mystery essentially, and then how much stress it takes up, how much stress it causes me. It's really different than how much it would have been, say, 10 years ago. So I think first you have to look at that. Um, and based off that, you're going to have to, I think, primarily focus on the how big of a deficit you are working for. Now, keep this in mind. I do feel that to a certain extent, like you don't want to run a 100 calorie deficit for months on end because that in itself is pretty worrying in a way. The length of the diet also matters. But if you were to ask me like which one, um, I guess, tends to chip away at a person more, I would say it's probably how steep the deficit is. So, okay.
We're back.
From personal experience, an 800 calorie deficit is going to be more taxing across the board than, say, a 400 calorie deficit. So I would probably venture for most people to start with a longer diet that maybe doesn't net you the weekly, the biweekly, the monthly returns you want in terms of weight loss, fat loss, but it keeps you in the game, like mentally. It keeps it from being too wearing. Um, and it's going to make it more likely that you get there because I think you've certainly have seen this, I'm sure as well, that people commit to a deficit that's too much too
Yeah.
soon right now, and then they find themselves yeah, 6 weeks down the road just like blowing the diet completely. So I
Yeah.
think I would, for the newer you are, the more I would gravitate towards a longer diet as opposed to a shorter, more intense diet. Um, so that's probably the first place I'd go with. Is just like let's try to lose at a very slow but predictable rate.
That 800 calories is a really good example because where do you go from there? I mean, like if you're already dieting at 1700 calories as a guy,
Mhm.
and where do you go? I mean, what are you gonna do now? That's the kind of running out of tools essentially, very very fast. And the reason why I ask you about the rate of weight loss is that I guess generally when people approach a fat loss phase, they're looking at it. Okay, when is this going to end? They're looking at it from immediately, how long do I have to suffer, and this is going to end at some point, and then they want to try to be even, let's say, a little bit too much obsessed with, okay, this is the end date, that's after that I'm going to be able to go back to whatever I previously was doing, and the world is over, now I'm shredded forever. That's kind of the mindset that a lot of people have. Would you recommend actually going a little bit more aggressive in the beginning and then tapering it off? Do you usually apply these kind of strategies?
For a beginner dieter, probably not. That is the approach that I seem to take, say for myself nowadays. Like I just actually I started a diet, my contest diet a few days ago, and I will start off pretty assertively, and then I'll bring it up to something more manageable.
Hmm.
So it's not a bad way to kickstart things because it gets you excited. You see good progress right away. Um, you see the progress. It's more, it's easier to commit to something that's less abstract, and you just kind of have to trust it's happening. Um, but for a beginner dieter, I'd say probably a good rule of thumb would be maybe the first three diets, fat loss phases that you go through, you commit to the long game as opposed to, being a bit more cynical with yourself.
Hmm.
And I mean, I've done it myself to the point where I have committed to diets. This is in recent years, like because I dread fat loss if there isn't a deadline or a reason to do it. Where I commit to a diet that's perhaps too overwhelming, and I end up having like 10 days into it, like having to adjust things. And oddly enough, it's because of behavior issues. I myself will find myself, you've kind of cheated the last like 2 of the last 4 days, dude. Maybe you need to turn the volume down just a little bit.
So you went, yeah. I guess that again, you kind of have that level of self-awareness now where you can see, okay, this is not going to work out for me long term, and
Um,
sustainability again is the biggest issue here. And in terms of the rates of fat loss, I guess that's to give people some practical recommendation here. Um, as you get closer to 10% body fat, let's use that as a rough figure at which you see your abs clearly. Um,
mhm.
how would that rate of fat loss change? I mean, the goal is, of course, to maintain lean body mass and to diet on as much calories as possible. We often hear these recommendations of like 1% of body weight per week, things like that. Would you say that that's kind of a good rule of thumb to go around, or it would depend on the person in some way?
I would almost always recommend it someone once they get to that point. 10% seems to be, I'd say, the wall for about 50% of men. Once you get to 10%, that is where things get a little rough, just to say the least. Just so many things, yeah, so many things that change at that point. Um, I would say before you do that, you'd probably want to have a diet break scheduled, just to kind of freshen up things a little bit, give you a little breath of fresh air before you dive in for that last bit. Um, Hopefully help regenerate a few of the hormonal things that we possibly still can at that point. And then I think the main difference is I think the rate of loss is still going to be somewhat similar to the I guess the good old rule of thumb of 1%.
Hmm.
However, the biggest difference I think is going to be like how long you wait to see if there is that change. Instead of looking at fat loss maybe weekly or bi-weekly, we might have to commit to these numbers for a full month, see what happens, and then see if we lose at that rate. I think at that point, because we touched upon hormones, one thing that men will experience a little bit more of that maybe they didn't when they were 12, 13 is a little bit more water retention. And
Hmm.
because of that, probably have to wait a little bit longer just to make it less murky and see if you are heading in the right direction. So that's
Hmm.
probably the biggest thing. Fat loss becomes a game of have you heard of the game of chicken, basically?
Yeah.
Right? It becomes a game of chicken, see who doesn't make the move when we cross that 10% barrier, if you will.
So I guess the case where people are at that point they lose trust in the process and then they end up over consuming calories or have you seen this from your experience? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, drastic measures are taken when in reality it was more about waiting. And yeah, you lose
hmm.
your ability to be objective. And I think namely because every day kind of sucks, at least at one point during the day. You will have some suck. And it's really hard to have 10 days that just absolutely like sucked, but you're not losing weight. And that's where people I need a refeed. I need a cheat meal. I need to
Cheat day.
add more cardio, just throwing these random things at something that might not even need to be fixed or adjusted at all.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the patience part is so difficult. Cortisol is through the roof. You've been dieted
Mhm.
for, let's say, lost 18 weeks and you took longer because you feel guilty as well. You maybe had a little bit of more food than you planned last weekend, and then you just like, oh, screwed all this stuff. Now, speaking of these, let's say we could almost name this as a quote unquote a plateau. You know, that's what most people
Mm,
would recognize the plateau. Um, Before we kind of, I guess, judge it as a plateau, what are some of the tools you would generally recommend for measuring progress aside from the obvious, which is the weight scale? I mean, that's some, if
mm.
you're trying to lose weight, if you don't have a scale nearby, what are you doing? But what are some of the other tools that, let's say, you would recommend having at your disposal to make you more objective? You know, that's
Mhm.
kind of the goal.
Um, as and I'm not saying this as a sales pitch, but I think having someone look over your stuff for you is probably the number one thing you can do to be more objective. Just have someone who you really trust take the controls from that point onwards, or maybe just like your first few fat loss phases in general. Um, I think in regards to plateaus, I think a lot of the same data that we were using before, like consistent pictures, consistent weigh-ins, they still apply. It's just scaling them so that we get more data, I guess, before we decide whether or not we have change. So what I'll do for a lot of my athletes is instead of again looking at the changes in average week to week, we'll just stretch it out to like we'll compare week 1 to week 4.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think what is the best tool? It's going to be time. It's going to come down to time, which is not a very sexy answer, but I think still the scale with the appropriate intervals between times where we decide whether or not what we're doing is working just needs to be extended as we get deeper into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that probably aside from the scale, taking clear and consistent pictures is probably going to be it's the one thing that can veto what the scale says. The scale might have said that in the last 3 weeks you increased by half a pound your average body weight, but you look leaner. The separation in your legs is a lot clearer. Your Christmas tree starting to show up. So that's why sometimes you need that data because if you're leaner, you're leaner. It's just that for one reason or another, it's just not showing up on the scale right now.
Nice. Yeah, that's such an important factor. And for Christmas tree, what for people that don't know, it's their lower back is getting more ripped and shredded, and you can actually see separation there. And the reason why we're even talking about this, and most people are looking at this, I mean, we're assuming that you guys approximately know your calories, you've figured out your macros, you're getting your protein, you're sleeping right, you're training right. We assume all of that because this is for guys that want to maximize results. I mean, if you're not doing all those things, you will greatly benefit from just doing that and then making sure. So what we're trying to preempt here is a little bit that you guys don't make the mistake of undercutting calories too soon or adding a ridiculous amount of cardio or just being frustrated where you blow out your diet, overeating, cheat meals, cheat days, turn into cheat weeks easily, and uh, and that everything just kind of blows up. Now, talking about plateaus, how would you diagnose a plateau? How would you say, well, this person is now in a plateau?
Okay. So I think the biggest reason that plateaus happen is just going to be getting smaller as a person. So as you get smaller, you're just going to need less calories. So like for example, a very generic good place to start off for with weight loss in terms of like calories is we'll just throw out the generic 11 calories per pound. Most people will see weight loss there. Um, but if you lose 20 pounds, that figure is going to change. Your new body weight multiplied by 11 is going to be quite
Yeah.
a bit different, right? So I think that's the first place you go to is like, have I lost enough weight to the point where maybe that formula that I know that I lose, maybe you're super experienced and you know that you lose at 11.5 calories per pound, like super well. Is that still applicable? So you have to every, I'd say 10 or so pounds, like check up on that one and see if it's still there.
Hmm.
um, so sometimes you can just stay ahead of the curve, although that's something that perhaps is best left to the experienced dieter. The less experienced dieter, obviously, you're kind of like swimming and sifting through this sea of unknown, and you don't know where your stubborn points are all the time. You don't know how to react, and if you're reading the right data. If you have not gotten leaner, if you have not lost weight in the last month, that would probably be a good place to change something during, I'll say, the second half of a diet. During the earlier stages, I think you do want to see whether it be visual changes or changes on the scale bi-weekly.
hmm Yeah, it makes total sense. And I like the fact that you said there that staying kind of ahead of the curve. And this is a common recommendation. I mean, there's been attempts at quantifying the, let's say, adjustment, how much your body adjusts. So for a pound lost, I mean, there's some numbers thrown out there. There's 50 calories basically needs to be reduced from the diet. And I would, exactly what you said, recommend this for experienced lifters to try to, let's say, kind of taper those calories and make sure that happens. But for anybody else, patience seems to be the the lesson as usual. You know, with a lot of these things, it is really patience. Now, let's say at that point someone is plateaued. How big of a reduction do you generally tend to make? Someone, let's say, diagnosed that they are in a plateau. Are you a fan of, like, let's say, kickstarting it, or with with more of a deficit, or are you plan, or more of a fan of a diet break or something like that?
Well, speaking on diet breaks, I think they should be kind of how a well-structured, well-rounded program has those weeks where you back off a little bit, and they should be pre-planned, as opposed to waiting until, like, you know what, I think I needed one 2 weeks ago. Um, I think with the diet, it's kind of the same thing. You want to have those scheduled, and I think typically every 8 to 10 weeks is probably a good place for most men generally. Women might need to go a little bit sooner than that, but this podcast is not about them. Well, but yeah, you want to have those scheduled, and I think that's going to definitely clear up a lot of assumed to be plateaus. Should you actually reach a plateau? I like my adjustments to affect the energy balance equation over the time span of, again, a month. So if I cut calories, I want it to be able to at least surpass, uh, I'm going to say that 3,500 calories it is a pound of stored fat. So I wanted to actually show up. I don't see the point to being stuck and removing uh, 10 grams of carbs from all days, as that is not really shifting it in to your benefit, the energy balance equation. I guess
hmm
the next question, when you're like, all right, so I'm gonna leave a dent, and I'm gonna make, I'm gonna put myself back in a deficit, very clearly. So again, like pretty big chunks. I'll do something like, let's cut 50 grams of carbohydrate from all day. So, like, let's cut down 200 calories. The question that comes with that is, like, so when do you know when to, pick on the nutrition as opposed to the cardio? And there's a few variables right away that come into play. I think if you are someone who is young and can potentially handle a little bit more physical activity, maybe you have a little bit more work capacity than someone who's twice your age, throw some cardio at that person. Why not, right? But typically, I have found that when you adjust nutrition, it's just a whole lot more predictable. Whereas you can give someone extra cardio, and let's just say they're a personal trainer at the gym, they're working with clients all day, and they used to grab the dumbbells for the clients, and now they're just kind of chilling there sitting because they don't have the energy to do anything. So usually formal physical activity, your body finds a way to counter that with kind of making you more of a sloth during other times. So what I would say is that early on, you can probably just generally across the board, you can probably add cardio, but as you get closer to the lower end of your set point, this is where, like, stairs start becoming an issue. This is where you start looking for, like, the best parking. This is where, like, you used to go to the water fountain in between sets, and now you find yourself just sitting there parked. Um, this is this is all behavior when you're starting to get to that, I guess, that 10-ish% wall. And at that point, I think more predictable results happen via nutrition. Because if
hmm
you add more cardio and you give them more cardio, what they end up doing is their NEAT expenditure, which is a big part of our total caloric output, on a daily basis. That starts to, like, downshift, and we tend to move less subconsciously.
Yeah, there's so much adaptation going on there, especially stuff that you can't even control. I mean, stuff that you mentioned there is actually, I guess we can kind of see it. You know, someone fidgets
Hmm.
less, someone just doesn't use the stairs anymore. They're just waiting for the elevator for 20 minutes,
Yeah. Yep.
standing there. While in reality, I mean, even cardio itself can backfire. I've seen it backfire, and there's some decent evidence to support that.
Yeah.
That some people just be more hungry, which is something that again you need to know how your own response is to that thing. Now, speaking of, let's say, those last points, and you said diet breaks there. Now, it's a common, I guess, almost as an opposite point. People will some will say, "Hey, refeeds are all you need. You don't really need diet breaks. It's just incorporate some kind of caloric cycling." And I'm just gonna say to the guy, like my own opinion is that diet breaks are far, far, far more valuable than refeeds. I've lost kind of all my trust in daily refeeds, so I don't know your point in this, but that's just my idea that just from my experience.
With the diet breaks, I think even if you see it as a waste of time, like I'm gonna lose a week. I think especially for the drug-free lifter, you're going to find that as you get deeper into a dieting phase, your recovery becomes quite erratic. Right? You're not able to recover as much as when you were eating a whole cow a day, like when you were gaining. And so it's important that you lift throughout your fat loss phase. If you don't lift like at a level that resembles what you were doing in during the gaining phase, you're not going to keep a whole lot of muscle. And this is where I feel that diet breaks really come in handy because whatever gap you did have in terms of recovery, you can catch right back up.
Hmm.
Um, so there's many ways of I think structuring it so it runs concurrently with your resistance training program. You can have it on the toughest week of your weight training program, or perhaps I think something that's often overlooked is on a deload week where you're not training as hard. And maybe this is a good time to like because part of the deload is to give your body a chance to breathe and make those adaptations to catch up. And
Hmm.
throwing some extra food in there and get back to where you feel like a person in the gym again. Um, so yeah, I think in regards to like diet breaks versus refeeds, if we had to pick one or the other, like you could either use a diet break or like weekly refeeds, I would definitely say that I would be much more comfortable with someone having a linear intake and then having refeeds that were scheduled, every few weeks or so. I think that would probably just intuitively, based on what I've seen, I think that would have much better results. I don't know if you've had this happen to you, but you think you're stuck, and that's partially why you introduced the diet break
Hmm.
and then you see that you weren't. You lost
Oh, yeah.
4 pounds that week because all this water retention. Your muscles get full, so you're like, oh man, I still have all that muscle I thought I had, but for a minute there I thought I lost. So diet breaks again, fat loss. There's just and just like this whole there's a culture that comes with this where beast mode, go hard. You know, that's not always the answer. Like sometimes the answer is actually taking a step back and not grinding yourself into dust. So yeah, diet
Hmm.
breaks. If you haven't done it, do it. You'll never do it without it again.
Yeah, yeah, diet breaks, such an underestimated tool. And deloads as well. You mentioned deloads, and I mean, kind of brings up the question of we didn't even talk about training at all. And we're going to keep it short because this mostly is about nutrition side of things, I guess. We kind of assume that everybody has training handled, which is it's a
Yeah.
whole different issue. One thing with training, I guess the most common thing that is under debate is now, is it real? I mean, some people will say, well, training doesn't really change at all in a fat loss phase, right? Training doesn't change, and you should actually be getting stronger, and that's kind of, I guess, for most intermediate and novice lifters, would you say that that would be correct? Or
I'd go as far as saying like even some advanced lifters. And I think a lot of it, if you can progress the first few weeks of a fat loss diet, chances are you're running a pretty sound resistance training program. So I think that's one of the hallmarks of hey, what you're doing is probably a pretty good approach because it kind of ticks with how you're able to recover at this point and what kind of progress is realistic for you at this point. Um, I would say that, yeah, I think it should be a goal, and I think it's a little bit more common than people think, perhaps. And I think a lot of it just with the lifter being so excited. to actually like start the fat loss phase. I mean, when you're about to cut and you're about to cash in your investments from this gaining phase, you're like, here I go. Um, so yeah, it's possible, and it should be something you aim for, because at some point, especially if you plan to go deep in your fat loss phase, you're going to regress. So it's kind of nice to still build up your work capacity at least a little bit, so that when it does come back down, you're right about where you started ideally.
Mm-hmm. Because I mean, a lot of people will say, "Well, I'm going on a cut, so I'm just going to drastically reduce my volume." You know, people will make that, and let's say we would say that probably isn't a good idea. I mean, try to keep it as much as you can, right?
Yeah, there's as many of you guys out there might know, there's a strong correlation between volume and muscle growth. So you definitely want to keep that around as long as possible. Now there might be some phases later on where you have to, yeah, where you have to perhaps make some adjustments. I think especially when you're getting to that turbulent point where it's like 10% body fat and below, and that's fine. You just don't want to spend the entirety of your fat loss phase detraining yourself. That would definitely lead to a final product that would be not so good.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of training, since I guess one final question on this, it's kind of a I guess debate whether, well, are we going to adjust our training to compensate for the lack of volume by increasing the amount of reps that we're doing, so now reps go high and then we can kind of compensate, or do we keep lifting heavy even though the volume is less? What would kind of, let's say, help retain muscle
Mhm.
mass? And anecdotally, as well, as I'm actually not aware of any particular research study that looked exactly at this.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that is yeah, I think that is a fine point you bring. There's really nothing out there that clues us in as to like which one potentially might be best. What I will say is that at least at this point, what the experts will tell you is like, hey, have a wide cocktail of your rep ranges. If you want to maximize muscle growth, have some heavy lifting in there, also have some volume. Um, it's probably the safest recommendation at this point.
mhm,
What I will say is, towards the end of a fat loss phase, what I would have the lifter do is perhaps go with what they can feel they can recover the best from, what they instinctively feel safer and more natural, and they have a performance is a bit more reminiscent of what they were able to do in the off season. So I'm gonna use myself for an example here, as I am a very small male in regards to just bone structure. And what ends up happening once I do get past that 10% mark is that how much my joints can like bear structurally, it downgrades quite a bit. And this is where you can go to some of that Schoenfeld research that he has done, where he's compared different rep ranges, and it's like, hey, you kind of end up at the same place. Um, I tend to favor the higher rep stuff because I can keep a lot of my output there. Whereas the heavy training, we might have to bring that'd probably be the first place I adjust and I bring that down. Now, you might have people who are the exact opposite. Like, let's just say you take a guy who, just making someone up here who's very convenient for me to use as a pretend case study. Say he's got very robust joints, diets on needs like lower calories, which usually means lower carbs to get to this 10% or so. For this person, they might favor the heavier lifting, and because they don't have the substrate to power through the volume work, that might be where they downshifted a little bit. So I would say this is where some experience comes in handy. Go through a few fat loss phases and take a step back and see what sucks more. Is it your strength specific work, or is it your volume specific work? And I think that is probably where I would lean towards in regards to recommendations. But that's probably the one thing about muscle growth that we're starting to find out more and more, is that the rep range isn't nearly as important as what is most practical for you. I know
mhm.
a guy at my gym, for him, he's always lifting 15s, always lifting 15s, because 15s, he's like, I can progress all day. It's super predictable. It never hurts me. I like the rep range. So it's like, keep doing that. Keep doing
Yeah.
15s until your face turns blue. So yeah, this is where you as a lifter, you have the option of saying, this is what feels best.
Nice recommendation. Because I guess if you have a well-structured plan, you are getting most of those different repetition ranges in the first place, so
Hmm.
you can kind of see, I guess, across the board which ones start aching and becoming more difficult. And I mean, heavy lifting at let's say below 5 target repetitions gets quite hard if you're super lean. I mean, the leverages change. I mean, everything changes. You know, you're gonna get screwed at some point if you're not adjusting. I guess if you're that body type, scrawny, I guess that stereotypical ectomorph from the back in the
Yeah.
day, some of the types, even though it's outdated. One thing, I guess. What it was a common question here, and I often get this is about intermittent fasting, right? So a lot of these, let's say, research studies looking at muscle retention, and I guess more enjoyment as well.
Hmm.
We can look at anecdotally, from at least from my experience, a lot of people find that intermittent caloric restriction works better than actual linear. I find that
Hmm.
for most people, they respond well to that. I mean, do you use a lot of let's say lean gains, kind of Martin Berkham style intermittent fasting or some other form, protein sparing modified fats, for example? Do you use any of
Hmm.
those tools frequently, or is it on like kind of rare?
The intermittent fasting, it's definitely something that works. If it works for you, boy, does it work for you, and it's a game changer, certainly for some people. Um, However, I think this is where that buzzword, like flexible dieting, comes into play. When I think of the word flexible dieting, I think people think, IIFYM, let's eat donuts and get shredded. Whereas I think of like flexible dieting as an educated dieter. I think that is probably the best way to describe it. Are you an educated dieter? Do you know why you're doing the things you're doing? There's some people that do, the lean gains protocol because Martin does it and Martin looks great. So that's enough. And to me, that's just not a sound reason to do it. Anecdotal enough to me would be enough. Like, oh, you've tried it, it works for you. Well, yeah, keep doing it. But what I like to see is I like to have a dietary setup where it lets the driver of the car kind of decide how they pace it out. And to me, that is a hallmark of flexible dieting. So, for example, in my case, as I get deeper into a contest prep, what I start to see is it used to be that I could eat 2 hours pre-training, 50 grams of carbs, and I'm good. But what ends up happening is that meal gets closer and closer and closer to my training hour, and the carbs tend to go up. I tend to throw more of them in there, and that works for me. And it's my diet as I get deeper into it kind of changes. Breakfast gets smaller. In fact, it does get
Mm-hmm.
smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So I could put more there pre-training,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a pliable system that not only I think goes with the lifter, the athlete, and what they like, but also can evolve as we get deeper.
I
There we
got
go.
you.
Okay, maybe you start off as a breakfast guy, and towards the end you are no longer a breakfast guy. So I think pliability within the system is important. Diets that are way too rigid don't let you move things around to better suit your needs at that current point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I go back to my first diet, and I remember I had a cup of oats to end the day, and I wanted to put it pre-training, and I'm like, but that's not following the diet, and that was just my lack of critical thinking. I was not an educated dieter, so yeah, pliability. I think you can have to restrict calories for sure, but there should be some wiggle room for the person who's undergoing the calorie restriction to decide what works best and what keeps me basically restricted, what keeps me adhering to the diet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with fasting, I like the point as well. I guess what you made there is like someone might find the 8 hour eating window or the 10 hour eating window too restrictive at some point. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I know I remember my last cut. I mean, just the fact that I thought that I can't eat for the next 3 hours made me hungry. Just
Yeah.
from me thinking, hey, I can't have any food now. All of a sudden, I want to eat, even though I probably aren't very hungry when I wake up. It's just even the mental side of it. It can start playing a role there. Uh, I like the fact that I guess with intermittent fasting, a lot of people do wake up, they're not super hungry, and don't, I guess, blow your calories when you're not hungry. Like
Yeah.
don't spend
Yeah.
your calories on food if you're not hungry, and then save it for when you are. And that's kind of the only rule of thumb that I would give. But generally, you would recommend a meal frequency between 3, 4, 5 feedings a day, or what's kind of.
Yeah, I think about 3 to 4 seems to work well for about 80% of people.
Hmm.
Um, I think typically too small of too few feedings, like you mentioned, you're just thinking about food all the time. And then when you're on the higher side, is the same thing. It's like you're thinking about food all the time because you're eating every 2 hours, and you're never really full. So yeah. And on another note, and this is something that you just kind of have to learn to get better at. And I've told this story a few times, but it always hits home. And like people will ask me, so when you're hungry, how do you deal with that? What do you do? And to be honest, like it's gotten to the point now where it's like this is just the zen of doing this long enough. Where like when I'm hungry, it's like, dude, I'm hungry. That is it. It's just kind of like the bottom of a squat. Doesn't that feel heavy? Yeah, it's heavy. It definitely feels heavy. But like this is what I'm doing to get where I need to go. So at a certain point, you're just gonna be hungry. And I think once you just kind of learn to set certain windows of that, it just becomes what it is.
It's a natural state, I guess. You just, hey, I'm
Yeah,
hungry, normal. And to be fair, it is probably the most normal state and the state that you would spend most of your life if you're a hunter-gatherer about 10,
yeah,
20,000 years ago. You'd probably spend most of your life hungry.
exactly.
And
There
now
was
it's like 2 hours no food, and you're like, oh my God, the world is gonna end.
and hunger comes in waves. It's like it's if you can get through that 30-minute window where it's just unbearable, you'll be on the other side and you're like, okay, I'm glad I didn't have that cookie I was saving for like, later today.
Would you say just the fact that you dieted for so many cycles kind of, I guess, built up that self-efficacy, that discipline, or more like resilient, like I would say emotional immune system almost at some point. That's what I like to call it. I mean, do you feel like do you feel like the benefit of in another part of your life as well because of this?
Absolutely. And you hear the progressive overload in the gym, and I'm sure if someone would have dropped a 300-pound squat on my back my first day in the gym, I would have just fell with it. And and I think sometimes people do that with diets. They commit to ways of doing it that, hey, it's like they got it from this guy, but hey, he's gone through 10 fat loss phases during their lifting career. So I think, yeah, that's something that, man, I had no willpower the first few go arounds. I didn't count a single calorie until 8 years into training, I think. 8 years into training. And even then I was very gentle in regards to like what I added. Like one year we added, hey, let's eat protein 4 times a week. Hey, let's try to keep our fats lower. Hey, let's eat some more fruits and vegetables. But it was small increments. And now I'm here like telling you when you're hungry, just be hungry. Just deal with it. But it took a while to get here, and it's very easy for me to say that.
Yeah, and the whole idea, I guess, two final points that I want to touch on before we go into kind of a quick rounds. I got just a few questions. Um, One is I actually talked about this with Eric Helms from 3DMJ last time when he spoke, and it's the whole idea of intuitive eating versus tracking. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of, I mean, people out there. There's a huge movement of people saying, well, you can just intuitively eat, and you're gonna get shredded. Now, I personally have my own opinion on that, which I've presented on social media many times, and people know I go on a huge rant against intuition because I feel like we aren't built to be intuitive eaters to get shredded. That doesn't make sense evolutionarily. But what's your opinion on just how far can you actually go with intuitive eating? I mean, I guess from your experience.
Yeah, it's something that for sure, like if you're going to give that a go, I don't think a caloric deficit is the first place to use that. You know, I think yeah, you need a few years of tracking both while eating enough or not eating enough, and then you can maybe take that up. But yeah, like you said, I think even the most elite of like natural bodybuilders, they get peeled to the bone if they were to just intuitively eat, I don't think they wouldn't be running around at the gym at 3, 4, or 5% body fat. No way. They would be in their that comfort zone. I tried it actually for my last contest prep. I tried to intuitively eat early on,
Hmm.
and I think I made it about 3 months in, and then it got to the point where it's like I'm having a hard time. I need a system, and I think it was a guest posing I did where I saw myself on stage. I thought it was quite well, And obviously, the proof was when I saw the pictures up there. I was like, oh, that is still a ways off from how I'm supposed to look like. There's still a pretty big gap in regards to like what I can um, objectively take on versus just kind of going by feel at this point. It just it doesn't work out past a certain point, and I think as you get more experience with this, maybe yeah, you might get to the point where it's like, hey, I'm gonna lose 10 pounds or so over the next 2 months, and that's probably okay. But I think for people who are really trying to push it in regards to body composition, I think humans we're here because our ancestors found food, because our ancestors, we're wired to get after it and work. So it's just yeah, it's expecting too much too soon for most people,
Yeah,
dieting wise,
and
fat
most
wise.
people for sure aren't gonna settle at being ripped like most all year round or something like that. I mean, there's probably a lot of lean guys, naturally lean guys that just fidget off 1,000 calories a day, and for them, they probably are wondering why would you even track calories, in the first place.
Mhm.
And I would say for most people, in most cases, it's going to be a battle between the irrational mind and staying objective as you approach that really shredded level where you're so hungry that intuitively I would be 300 pounds, if I was following my really my
Yes.
intuition of eating pancakes and donuts all day and stuff. Now, let's I guess the last question on anything that related aside from your this is I guess your experience as a coach, um, is there any special strategy, quote unquote, I use the word special here, that you would say anecdotally helps with let's say that final shred, that final couple of percentages. I mean, a lot of people say it's high intensity intervals, some recommend some supplementation on a natural basis or whatever that is, and then also some people say low carb slash keto tends to help them.
Mhm.
Now, what's your take on the last shred, I guess?
Ooh, kind of going back to that diet break, definitely entering it as fresh as possible. Um, And this goes past that diet break in a way too, because let's just say we're right at that like big barrier of like 10%. We got to climb that wall. I think the person who's gone through, let's just say, six adjustments to get there versus the person who's gotten through maybe one or two adjustments to get there, I'd put my money on the person who's been adjusted less, who's had less caloric cuts, has had less cardio added. Um, to have a better chance at making it. So I think that is the first one is, and that's why it's important to don't make moves, don't make adjustments until you truly need to. And then the other one goes even further back, and that's going to be if if you're starting your diet at 20% every time and your goal is to get to 10%, you are greatly decreasing your chances of getting there just because by the time you get there, your the willpower is going to be in the shitter pretty much. And you're
Hmm.
also most likely have gone through quite a few adjustments just to make it this close to that end goal. So it's not necessarily a solution. I think the solutions are straightforward. Get the energy balance equation back on your side. But I think the biggest issue is like try not to stay too far away from, the body fat percentage that you ultimately want to get to.
Hmm.
So that's probably the biggest secret is like the setup. It's all in the setup going into that.
So don't try to lose it all at once if it's your first time, or maybe when you're exiting it, try to exit to be not as fat as you
Yes,
began, and
yes.
then try to stay relatively lean. Because I know from personal experience, I mean, first cut is usually the hardest. At least the first cleanup, I like to say, and you're never
Yes.
happy with it. Like it's almost like a three-step process. Like clean up, go to lean gain a little bit, then go back and you get shredded easy. Like almost easy, it's never easy, but it's almost easy. Exponentially easier than, let's say, going into that almost like weird kind of overeating and depriving yourself cycle at the end of the first time when you try to get lean. From 12 to 10%, you actually kind of get a glimpse of it and you overeat, you go back, and it's just too hard because you're already at 1,700 calories. Because I'm very adaptive, as my metabolism is very adaptive. So that's a tough point there. So all right, so a lot of value, a lot of information here, and just a couple of quick round, just to kind of fire around questions. A lot of people asked about your personal kind of, I guess, takes and very quick answers and a couple of things. So, number one, how do you manage to cut on so many calories? Like, how do you cut on such high calories? People are
Mm.
wondering.
Yeah, I think I'm that fidgety person. I don't even realize I'm doing it half the time. I don't at all. Um, my girlfriend would say, like in some way, she's like, "You don't have like a lazy bone in you." Like my idea of de-stressing is like I'll go clean or something. I'll go pick up the dog poop in the backyard. So it's like little things like that. I don't realize that I'm doing it, but I do vividly recall my father telling me, like as a kid, he's like, "I took you to the park twice and you're still not freaking tired." Um, so yeah, that's probably a major deterrent, like for me to ever have kids, because they're going to be exhausting. But yeah, I think a lot of it is subconscious physical activity, and I think just in regards to my my body would like to see me at 130 pounds. So this is like a huge version of myself. I'm a very small person, um, naturally,
Hmm.
and that's basically where it goes to. But I think the majority of it, honestly, it's just the fact that I will take 4,000 steps inside my house without knowing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot. That's quite a bit.
I
It's
catch myself running up the stairs. I'm like, why are you running up the stairs? There's like no urgency. So,
Nice.
yeah,
Yeah, that's good. You're the high neato type.
definitely.
Um, do you prefer a more blender diet, or are you more in kind of the flexible Pop Tarts realm?
Mm. I think there's definitely something to having a more bland diet sometimes, especially when you're going through because nothing really quite quenches the spot when you're like deep into a fat loss phase. I remember my first actual diet where I got shredded, and it was like IIFYM Junior, if you will. And I remember like having Cheerios during a diet was like naughty to me. It was like this, like, oh, you don't ever do that. But it got to the point where I was just eating like most of the foods were kind of like as unclean as Cheerios. And I remember I could like taste like the sweetness in the Cheerio, and I'm like, this is so good, and I'm eat this every day when it's done. And then the next one was a little bit different, where I started to have more diet sodas, more odd foods, ice cream, things like that. And your palate tends to kind of crave those. So you can modify your palate to a certain extent. And I would urge people to definitely include the foods they like, but also perhaps um, learn to like foods that maybe they don't absolutely love, but they can grow to love over time. And there's less trigger foods because they're not including pancakes 4 times a day or something like that. Yeah.
Awesome. Good. Good to give people, I guess, a little bit of a perspective there. And I think almost people today feel like they have to be flexible. Like it's almost
Yeah.
like I have to be flexible because I'm not cool on Instagram if I post my simple meal every day, you know. It is like that. I guess a couple of more like philosophical questions. Where do you see the fitness industry going? Like, what's the next big trend?
It's so unpredictable in some ways. Simply,
Okay, I got you
and we're
back.
back. Okay. Yeah, it's unpredictable because it's changed so much during the last 5 years. And I go back 10 years ago, it's like, wow. And then when I first picked up my magazine, my first muscle magazine in 1999, uh, it's like, how did this happen, right? Um, I don't know. I think, and I'm not too concerned. What I do see on the up and up is the evidence-based sector, picking up their piece of the pie. And so long as that keeps happening, like I will be one happy camper. So I see its influence. I go to some of the most like meathead gyms like in my town, and you'll hear buzzwords, and I'm like, I know where that came from. Oh, the reverse dieting. Oh, the macros. So we're influencing little by little. We're still the minority, but I think that I do see climbing. I do see it growing, and that's very exciting.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. You rarely see it in commercial gyms, that people are actually doing, let's say most people are still doing bro splits and things like that, but it is moving forward. It seems like it is. And you guys at 3DMJ are doing a fantastic job at that. I mean, you've been promoting, if it fits your macro, I mean, flexible dieting and actual proper conditioning in terms of competitions. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff being done in the past, cutting water, doing like all these kinds of weird manipulations that sometimes backfired at people and they really ended up in trouble. I guess the final question that I would like to ask you here is kind of a parting word of wisdom to a novice lifter that just started lifting. Um, if you could, I guess, advise that person something, or let's say tell yourself when you first stepped into the gym, what would you kind of, what would be that one piece of advice?
Um, I think men inherently think that they kind of know almost everything about weightlifting. Um, I think typically, like women are more likely to outsource those sort of things. Men not as much. It's that male ego, right? Um, if I could go back, because I kind of was that guy in some ways, I would probably have outsourced things a bit earlier. I would have done my best to learn from the best, or I didn't have as many options as people have today, which kind of brings up that point is like there's like no time like now. So I would definitely say is like learn from others, be very patient. Um, I think every major plateau or dry spot that I've encountered during it's like my 18th year of doing this now has been because I've been in too far of a rush that I end up backsliding, whether that be like the diet not working out or me getting hurt because I want all the progress now. Um, so yeah, I think, be patient, learn, and just like stick it through the long run. I think that's honestly, it used to be about what I could do this summer, and now it's gone to the point where like I fantasize about myself like hitting a 315 pound front squat like all the way down, and I'm 60 years old. You know, like so, yeah, yeah.
Good perspective, actually. It's patience. We're coming back at the key variable, I guess. Like, don't try to jump ahead of the learning curve. Some stuff takes time. Like stuff that actually is valuable takes a lot of time. And yeah, great words of wisdom there. And I want to thank you really for your time and for your wisdom for sharing here. 18 years of experience, and it's an honor to be able to actually have you here and talk to you. Which that's why I really love this time that we live in, where we can actually put this information out there and help people, and it's going to save a lot of people trouble and pain, and potentially get some new uh, natural bodybuilders, fitness enthusiasts, and everybody to spread the message. Where can people find more of your work, and just to give a little bit of I guess links and things like that?
Yeah, so 3D Muscle Journey, our website, we have a blog that's quite active there. Our podcast, I think we're kind of coming into our own with that one. It was initially it was a little awkward and silent, but it's feeling more like a hangout now. Our YouTube channel as well, Team 3DMJ. You can find me on Instagram where I am quite active on there, and I will even every once in a while get into that Instagram live, and just hang out with my people. So yeah, we're pretty active on social media, and we try to, even though we specialize in, I guess, the physique enthusiast that wants to recomp themselves like to these crazy extremes. I think a lot of the stuff we put out there can be scaled to just about any goal. The only difference is you just kind of you stop when you've had your fill, you know. Um,
Hmm.
but that's probably, yeah, that's probably the one thing we like. I have a lot of Skypes sometimes with people who refuse to lift weights, and they come to us because they understand that concept that we're all kind of after the same thing. Like my mom wants to put on muscle, build strength, get leaner. It's just not nearly to the scale that you and I want to do it, right? So a lot of good stuff there, and we cover a lot of different areas.
Yeah, definitely recommended to check out the podcast, the Instagram podcast. I really enjoyed listening to when I'm taking my walks around the city, and
Mhm.
it's been one of my favorite listens. And definitely, I will leave links to every single thing you mentioned there in the description for you
Thank
guys
you.
watching this, so you guys can check that out. As well, follow on Instagram. You post a lot of footage from training and things like that, which is super super cool. People will, I guess, get to see how it's done on a world class level, which is something that we definitely want to promote more. And I want to thank you for all the stuff that you've done. It inspired me as well to become a better coach, to become a better lifter. You can always learn. And aside from that, man, thank you for being here. And everybody, thank you for watching this such a long interview. I know you guys could have spent an hour doing something else. I know you could have watched the Netflix or something like that. And I'm glad that you're here with us. And that's a big thing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
See you guys soon. Peace.